There is a chair in Rome no one sees, not because it is hidden behind walls, but because no one looks where light does not fall. Every photograph of the Vatican shows the same symbols: marble saints, golden halos, papal robes fluttering like sails in the wind of reverence. But just beyond the colonnades, in a modest stone building with no crowds, no incense, and no applause, decisions are made that never pass through stained glass. They begin not with scripture, but with silence. The world recognizes the white throne. It bows when the Pope speaks, photographs when he waves, and headlines his words as if they were prophecy. But history, when read without ceremony, suggests something else entirely. There is another presence, darker not in morality, but in method. They call him the Black Pope. He does not address the masses, yet shapes what they believe. He holds no crucifix in public, but those who kneel before altars unknowingly echo his design. His name does not stir devotion. It stirs protocol. Arturo Sosa is the 31st Superior General of the Society of Jesus, better known as the Jesuits. His office is not inside St. Peter's Basilica, but just beside it, in a building called the Curia Generalizia. There, without banners or bells, he oversees a network older than many nations, wider than any denomination, and deeper than most intelligence agencies would care to admit. He is not a cardinal. He does not wear white. He does not appear on balconies, but his influence flows like an underground current beneath the Vatican, shaping tides unseen from above. The Jesuits were not designed to be gentle. They were forged in conflict during the Protestant Reformation, when doctrines cracked and kings broke from Rome. Where sermons failed, strategy succeeded. Ignatius of Loyola, the order's founder, had once been a soldier. When his body broke in war, his spirit rearmed itself in scripture, but never abandoned command. He reimagined a religious order not as a sanctuary, but as a military structure. It had ranks, protocols, and an oath unlike any other. This is where the story begins to distort. For most orders, obedience means humility. For the Jesuits, obedience is transformation. The final vow of a Jesuit is not simply to God or the Church, but to the Superior General. His command is considered the voice of providence, not metaphorically. Literally, a true Jesuit does not act with personal conscience, but with instructed will. He becomes an extension of a higher design, often without understanding the full shape of that design himself. No blessing is needed to initiate this system. It functions in silence. There are no rallies, no public declarations, only the movement of minds calibrated to one thought system, directed from a central axis the world rarely mentions. The Black Pope does not rule with declarations. He adjusts direction with glances, with internal memos, with the calibration of curriculum in a Jesuit university halfway across the world. The Pope in white appears for Christmas. The one in black writes the calendar. This separation of visibility and power is not accidental. It is design. In every kingdom, visibility draws scrutiny. In every empire, scrutiny invites resistance. But what is not seen is not resisted. It is absorbed. This is why the Jesuit model has endured where others fell. Benedictine silence was noble. Franciscan poverty was pure. But Jesuit strategy was survival. Their motto was not carved into altars. It was whispered in libraries, written in the margins of educational reforms, embedded in the language of social justice and moral progress. Perindi eis cadaver, as a corpse obeys. That was the ideal: to move without hesitation, to act without personal filter, to operate as one limb of a larger body whose head remained invisible. And yet, even a corpse is still a vessel. Someone, somewhere, gives the order. In modern governance, such total submission is rare. Politicians are questioned. CEOs are replaced, even popes retire. But the superior general is not a public role. He is elected only by a small body of senior Jesuits, men who themselves were molded under the same discipline, loyal to the same structure, fluent in the same silence. No press announces his ascension, no crowds cheer. But once chosen, his voice becomes the unspoken axis around which a global network turns. His power is not symbolic, it is operational. He oversees personnel across 112 countries. He manages educational institutions from Boston to Manila, from Kinshasa to Tokyo. He receives reports, analyzes socio-political currents, and reallocates influence, not as policy, but as curriculum. While governments build weapons and companies build products, Jesuit institutions build minds. And in a world shaped by thought more than force, that influence is cathedral-like in scale. There is something deeply unsettling about this, not because it is inherently evil, but because it is largely unknown. The average citizen cannot name the current superior general. Most Catholics cannot. And yet, the philosophies taught at elite universities, the moral frameworks echoed in humanitarian platforms, the social values embedded in global ethics, many trace subtle roots to the ideas curated under his oversight. This is not conjecture. It is repetition across centuries. The Jesuits do not hold office. They write textbooks. They do not rule nations. They shape the individuals who do. And when the shape of thought becomes predictable, controllable, standardized, power no longer needs to conquer. It simply flows, like ink in a pre-written manuscript. The Vatican knows this. It benefits from this, but it does not fully control it. There have been moments, quiet tensions, where popes themselves were unnerved by how far Jesuit influence extended beyond doctrinal boundaries. In 1773, Pope Clement XIV suppressed the order under immense pressure, but the suppression only scattered the seeds wider. Within 40 years, the Jesuits returned, stronger, quieter, embedded deeper. Why would an institution so feared by monarchs, so pressured by empires, so condemned by clergy, never vanish? What is the architecture beneath their resilience? Perhaps it lies not in what they teach, but in how they embed their teachings. Not in doctrine, but in delivery. Not in creed, but in command. And that command, always, emanates from a voice never heard in public. The Black Pope remains unnamed in textbooks, unseen in broadcasts, unacknowledged in diplomatic events. And yet, his signature is implicit in the tone of modern religious tolerance, in the phrasing of global humanitarian charters, in the shared vocabulary of faith-based ethics and policy frameworks. His influence does not declare itself. It is simply present, like architecture beneath painted walls. So, when people gather in St. Peter's Square, when cameras turn toward the balcony, when the Pope waves and the world listens, there is one question that remains. Who wrote the words? Who shaped the moment before the moment happened? And why does that name never appear in the history lesson? An oath, in most traditions, is a spoken contract, but in the deeper vaults of power, an oath becomes something else entirely, a deletion, not a declaration. Within the Society of Jesus, the final vow is not a promise, but a transformation. It is the quiet disintegration of the self, layer by layer, until only instruction remains. There is no applause when it is given, no witness to record it, and yet, from that moment on, a man no longer belongs to himself. He has no will but that of the order. The text of the oath, in its fullest form, is rarely quoted aloud. It speaks of loyalty beyond death, obedience beyond reason, and mission beyond morality. Scholars debate whether the infamous extreme oath is real or a fabrication born of fear. But whether apocryphal or hidden, the intent echoes in the structure of the Jesuit path. Each man, once accepted, begins not with faith but with erasure. He is not asked what he believes. He is told how belief is to be used. Years of training precede this point. Theology, philosophy, rhetoric, languages, history, strategy. The mind is sharpened like a blade, but never permitted to wield itself. Every answer given is measured not by originality, but by harmony with the order. Questions are welcomed, but only if they end at the correct conclusion. Dissent is not punished. It is dissolved. In such an environment, the most dangerous heresy is not a spoken rebellion. It is a moment of internal hesitation. The metaphor they use is chilling. Perindo asi cadaver, like a corpse before your superior. No will, no resistance, no judgment. In that submission, they claim, lies perfect unity. But unity with what? Not with God. For the Church already provides that bond, not with humanity. For the mission is above nations, above people. The unity is with something older, colder, more precise, a machine of thought, engineered over centuries, operated by a single unseen hand. That hand is the superior general. His authority is not spiritual, though it wears the language of holiness. It is operational, tactical, and absolute. When he speaks, the order does not deliberate. It mobilizes. When he changes direction, the entire structure tilts with him. This is not governance, it is architecture. And in that architecture, oaths are not bonds, they are locks. Once turned, they cannot be undone. Unlike popes, who are elected by cardinals and presented to the world in ceremonial light, the superior general is chosen in private by a body known as the General Congregation. Its members are senior Jesuits, men shaped by decades of discipline, trained not only in scripture but in systems. The selection process is secret. No speeches are made, no platforms presented. Each vote is cast in silence, each name whispered with calculation. When the decision is final, there is no coronation, only a shift in gravity. It is said that the newly elected superior general kneels in the chapel, alone, before an altar no one else sees. There, he assumes control of a global entity so disciplined, so embedded, that it no longer needs commands, only intention. His first instruction is rarely made public, but from that point forward, the world begins to adjust, quietly, invisibly, irrevocably. This is what sets the Jesuit oath apart. It is not aimed at salvation, it is aimed at synchronization. Jesuit missionaries, scholars, and educators scattered across continents operate with such cohesion that one might believe they are responding to local needs. But when examined closely, the timing, the language, the priorities align too perfectly. A change in tone at a university in South America mirrors a shift in curriculum in Southeast Asia. A theological position echoed in Nairobi appears days later in Boston. Coincidence becomes choreography, and that choreography follows no border. The Jesuits do not belong to a nation. Their allegiance is not to governments, not even to the Vatican in the traditional sense. Their loyalty is vertical, upward to the superior general, whose directives shape a structure that cuts across civil law, national identity, and doctrinal debate. This is not religious unity. It is ideological control masked as mission. Critics of the order have often feared this centralization, not because they believe in malevolence, but because they understand systems. Any architecture of belief so absolute, so secretive, so immune to external correction, becomes vulnerable to its own mythology. When obedience becomes absolute and secrecy becomes virtue, truth becomes malleable. And those who question the official version do not face punishment, they face silence. The Jesuit oath is not enforced by threat, it is enforced by purpose. Each member believes in the order's destiny, shaped by centuries of survival, sanctified by historical victories, and cloaked in divine purpose. But destiny is a dangerous compass. When men believe they are carrying out a plan written beyond their understanding, they stop asking whether it should be done, only how. This is where the oath becomes more than ritual. It becomes infrastructure. The average Jesuit may never meet the superior general. He may never read his full instructions. But the oath ensures that when a directive arrives, be it a new doctrine, a shift in focus, a controversial alliance, it will not be resisted. It will be implemented, refined, and multiplied. No debate, no deviation, only motion. Such discipline is rare in religious institutions. Most are fragmented by local tradition, cultural interpretation, and theological variance. But the Jesuits, bound by oath, do not fragment, they adapt. Their strategies evolve, their language modernizes, but the command structure remains untouched. And in that unwavering hierarchy, the Black Pope operates without interference. This has consequences far beyond the Church, in politics, education, media, and diplomacy. Former Jesuits or those educated under their system carry embedded frameworks. They do not need to cite the oath. The pattern is already imprinted. Certain ideas are never questioned, certain alliances never exposed, certain histories never told in full. And when challenged, the response is not defense. It is redirection, polished, articulate, and quiet. The oath, then, is not a statement. It is a shield. It allows the superior general to operate without transparency, because those beneath him do not demand it. It allows influence to spread without ownership, because those enacting it do not see themselves as authors. It allows the Jesuits to remain both present and invisible, everywhere involved, nowhere responsible. And yet, in this silence, something darker emerges. When an oath is absolute, it replaces discernment with duty. When a man becomes a tool, he may serve causes he does not comprehend. And when an institution builds its loyalty on such foundations, it becomes not a church within a church, but a system outside all systems, answerable only to its own reflection. So, when a Jesuit takes that final vow, the world does not notice. There are no headlines, no public markers. But somewhere, beneath the echoing vaults of Rome, a signal moves. And somewhere else, far from cameras and cathedrals, a mission begins, silent, precise, obedient. In the heart of Vatican City, where prayers echo through stone corridors and incense rises like breath from centuries past, there exists a second architecture, one that does not reflect sunlight, but absorbs it. It is not found on pilgrim maps or tour guide pamphlets. Its presence is not marked by stained glass or holy relics. Yet, within its walls, strategy replaces sermon, and belief is tempered like steel. This is not where faith is declared. It is where it is refined, sharpened, and, when necessary, redirected. Beneath the spiritual canopy of the Catholic Church lies a structure few dare to name aloud, not because it is illegal, but because it is immovable. They call it the church within the church, a phrase spoken in whispers by clergy who have seen its influence stretch beyond Scripture. It is not metaphorical, it is infrastructural. Every Jesuit school, mission, university, and research center acts like a vertebra in a skeleton that stands behind the white throne. A second spine, hidden but holding weight. This architecture was never built to compete with the Vatican. It was built to outlast its volatility. While popes change and councils debate, the Jesuit network continues unbroken, smooth in transition, quiet in motion. It does not require public trust. It requires internal cohesion. And that cohesion is sustained not by theology alone, but by design. Every role has a mirror. Every function has redundancy. The official church is visible. The internal church is operational. To understand this duality, one must first discard the idea that power resides solely in visibility. In the Vatican, visibility is often ceremonial. Authority, on the other hand, moves beneath protocol. When a pope blesses the crowd, he transmits tradition. But when Jesuit institutions publish new ethical frameworks, revise philosophical curricula, or issue subtle moral guidance, they transmit direction. One is sacred theater. The other is strategic engineering. In most ecclesiastical orders, decentralization creates variety. Franciscans emphasize poverty. Benedictines cultivate contemplation. Dominicans guard doctrine. But the Jesuits were never designed to specialize in a virtue. They were designed to specialize in function. Wherever there is a need for defense, adaptation, or infiltration, they appear not with force, but with familiarity. In local dress, fluent in native tongues, trained not only in scripture, but in systems of influence. And when the mission is fulfilled, they vanish without procession. This ability to move between the visible and the invisible is not a talent. It is a mandate. The Society of Jesus has always existed in parallel to the official church, not opposed to it, but orbiting it, adjusting its gravitational pull. The Pope may set moral tone, but the Jesuits write the subtext. Their presence in education, diplomacy, and academia is not accidental, it is structural. It ensures that even as surface theology remains constant, its interpretation can evolve to suit shifting environments. Over time, this parallel infrastructure has grown so vast that few can chart its edges. Jesuit universities operate on every continent, producing not just clergy, but politicians, scientists, economists, and strategists. Their alumni sit in cabinets, direct central banks, advise global institutions, and while these individuals may no longer wear black robes, their thinking still carries its fingerprint: strategic empathy, calculated dialogue, ideological adaptability. This is not indoctrination, it is imprinting. Inside the church, some have raised alarm, not with rebellion, but with concern. They see the Jesuit model not as faith-based, but system-based, a blueprint that adapts faster than doctrine can catch it. When moral debates arise over science, ethics, governance, it is often Jesuit-trained scholars who shape the conversation. Not with slogans, but with definitions. And when one controls the language of a debate, one controls its outcome. This subtle dominance has caused friction. Traditionalists within the church often view the Jesuits with suspicion, not because they are heretical, but because they are too effective. They do not simply preach, they analyze. They do not wait for revelation, they forecast. And in doing so, they often arrive at solutions before the church has finished deliberating the question. It is not disobedience, it is initiative. Yet, such initiative, unchecked, becomes indistinguishable from authority. When Jesuit institutions become the moral compass of their regions, when their policies influence public health, economics, and education, they begin to resemble a church more active than the Vatican itself. And when that church answers only to its superior general, the balance tilts, not violently, but decisively. In this internal architecture, the Pope is a symbol. The Black Pope is a strategist. One speaks to the faithful. The other speaks through the faithful, by shaping those who shape the world. And unlike the visible church, this inner network requires no rituals to sustain it. Its mass is data. Its incense is policy. Its relics are frameworks etched into textbooks, constitutions, and moral codes across generations. The phrase church within a church was once seen as exaggeration. Now, it is understatement. This is not a hidden branch. It is an alternate root system, drawing from the same soil of faith, but channeling growth in its own direction. And like roots beneath stone, its presence is revealed not in its appearance, but in the slow, silent way it shifts the ground above. If this architecture were ever exposed, it would not collapse. it would be misunderstood. People would search for conspiracy, for malevolence. But there is no villain here, only velocity. A system moving too efficiently, too independently, to be governed by the surface hierarchy. The question is not whether the Jesuits oppose the Pope, it is whether they still need him. History offers clues. Papal decrees have attempted to restrain the order. In 1773, Pope Clement XIV issued Dominus Ax Redemptor, dissolving the society. But the structure did not vanish. It scattered, embedded itself deeper, changed names, continued its mission. When the order was restored in 1814, it returned stronger, not out of penance, but necessity. The Vatican had realized it could not defend the Church alone. It needed the system it once feared. And so, the Church within the Church became not a threat, but a skeleton key, capable of unlocking influence in places where doctrine alone could not tread. It became the Vatican's silent partner, and over time, it began to speak more clearly than the Vatican itself. Today, the balance remains delicate. Publicly, the Pope leads. Privately, the network listens to another voice, one that does not broadcast, one that does not explain, one that moves only when it must, and always with purpose. So, when news emerges from the Vatican, a new encyclical, a revised stance, a global initiative, listen closely, not to what is said, but to how it is phrased. Trace the language back, through institutions and essays, to the unseen architects who shaped its terms, and then ask, not who speaks from the balcony, but who writes behind the curtain. The most enduring form of control is not physical, it is intellectual. Swords rust, crowns fall, and armies dissolve into memory. But a well-seated idea can echo for centuries. That is the terrain where the Jesuits excel, not in converting crowds or performing miracles, but in crafting frameworks of thought. They do not invade nations. They build classrooms. They do not demand obedience. They shape conviction. And in doing so, they influence not just what people believe, but how they come to believe anything at all. From their earliest days, the Jesuits understood that education was not a charitable mission. It was a strategic imperative. To guide the moral compass of a civilization, one must first manufacture the compass. So, they founded colleges, not in isolation, but in the beating hearts of cities and courts: Rome, Paris, Vienna, Goa, Kyoto, Boston. Each location was chosen not for evangelization, but for proximity to future influence. The students they taught were not peasants. They were princes, scholars, heirs to power, and the education they received was not passive, it was formative. In Jesuit pedagogy, curriculum is never neutral. Every subject, from mathematics to literature, is infused with moral philosophy, rhetorical discipline, and ethical framing. The goal is not to deliver information, but to instill an operating system, a way of processing the world that subtly aligns with the principles of the order. Students are not merely tested on knowledge. They are trained to argue, to persuade, to see systems where others see noise. It is a curriculum of command, disguised as enlightenment. Over time, these graduates ascend. They become judges, diplomats, financiers, ministers, and wherever they go, they carry with them not only their titles, but their training. They speak with the calm confidence of those who once debated theology at dawn and defended logic before breakfast. They make decisions not by instinct, but by calibrated discernment. And often, without realizing it, they extend the reach of the Jesuit network, not through affiliation, but through framework. This is the genius of the Jesuit system. It does not require loyalty. It only requires resonance. Once a mind has been shaped to seek order, to prioritize ethics, to find beauty in structure, it becomes naturally aligned with the architecture of the society. There is no need to issue orders. The pattern repeats itself, quietly, organically, like seeds scattered by wind, taking root where the soil is ready. In modern times, this influence has expanded into domains beyond theology. Jesuit institutions now lead in philosophy, political science, international relations, economics, media ethics. At universities like Georgetown, Fordham, Boston College, Sophia University, or Universidad Iberoamericana, students absorb not just knowledge, but direction. They are taught to think globally, act locally, and lead quietly. The vocabulary of social justice, climate ethics, responsible governance, these are not spontaneous cultural values. They are curated educational legacies. And in this web of education, one thread remains consistent: the source. Behind every curriculum revision, every policy publication, every leadership seminar, there is a center of analysis. Reports are reviewed, patterns are tracked, thought is coordinated, not like propaganda, but like symphony. Different melodies for different regions, but the same rhythm underneath. That rhythm is set by the superior general. He does not need to visit these institutions. His presence is structural. Each rector, each department head, each advisory board member carries a portion of the code. They understand the mission. They align the tone. And when the world begins to shift, politically, socially, ideologically, they adjust, subtly, like a bird correcting its flight midair. This is not conspiracy. It is coordination. It is what happens when a network of thinkers shares not just goals, but grammar. The Jesuits know that revolutions can be reversed, laws repealed, and governments overturned. But education, once embedded, persists. A child taught to question well, to argue ethically, to trust process over emotion, grows into an adult who will shape policy without ever realizing the ideology behind it was curated generations before. And when enough adults like that enter the system, society does not change by decree. It changes by inclination. This is the real cathedral, not the marble walls of Rome, but the invisible architecture of thought. And in that structure, the Jesuits are master masons. They do not build temples, they build minds. And those minds, in turn, build the future. Critics often ask how an organization rooted in 16th century Catholicism can still influence modern secular institutions. The answer lies not in dogma, but in design. The Jesuits have always adapted their language to the age. In times of monarchy, they spoke to kings. In times of revolution, they spoke to rebels. In times of science, they spoke through data. In times of crisis, they speak through ethics. Always fluent, always present, always slightly ahead of the curve. Their educational model avoids extremes. It teaches balance, not fundamentalism, but framework, not submission, but structure. This is why their alumni can sit in opposing cabinets, advise conflicting regimes, or draft contradictory laws, yet still speak in strangely similar tones. Because the training they received was not about content. It was about cognition. And behind that cognition, there is always the silent presence of the oath, not enforced, not repeated, but remembered. Even if forgotten consciously, its logic remains. Defer to reason. Respect hierarchy. Serve the mission. When faced with complexity, seek structure. When challenged, respond with clarity. When leading, lead softly, but with intention. The result is a generation of global influencers who do not identify as Jesuits, yet carry the order's signature. From the United Nations to the World Bank, from editorial boards to climate policy summits, the tone is recognizable, not in what is said, but in how it is said. Precision over passion, balance over noise, intellect over impulse. This, then, is the legacy of Jesuit education, not a chain, but a current. It moves beneath the visible world, shaping contours slowly, predictably, and as long as that current flows, the order does not need to fight for visibility. It already holds the infrastructure of belief. So, the next time a global declaration is made, from a government, a university, or a pulpit, listen not for ideology. Listen for symmetry. Listen for the echo of a curriculum designed not to dominate, but to guide without ever declaring it does. The fire of the Inquisition is remembered through flames, but its true machinery ran cold, precise, and wordless. Trials may have captured the public eye, but decisions were often made long before the accused entered the chamber. Doctrine was not merely defended by torches, it was shaped behind desks, in dim halls of analysis, by minds trained not to shout heresy, but to calculate which questions were dangerous before they were ever asked aloud. And at the center of that unseen process stood the Jesuits, not as executioners, but as designers of thresholds. While history recalls the Inquisition as a brute force of punishment, few recognize how subtly its modern form evolved through intellectual architecture. The Jesuits did not invent the Inquisition, but by the 16th century, they had quietly become its most effective compass. Their role was not to ignite fear, it was to define its parameters, to draw the line so delicately that no one would risk approaching it again. They understood that the most efficient form of suppression was not torture, it was preemption. In Jesuit-run institutions, orthodoxy was not declared through fear, but through structure. Students were guided through philosophy not as exploration, but as filtration. The right questions were rewarded with depth. The wrong ones were redirected or quietly ignored. Over time, this refined obedience created an ecosystem where divergence was not punished. It was never born. Independent thought did not disappear because it was hunted. It vanished because it was never nurtured. A ghost of possibility, erased before it could take form. The superior general, though absent from tribunals, sat at the apex of this system. From his headquarters in Rome, he received reports from across Europe, summaries of sermons, theological disputes, private conversations among clergy. He read not just what was said, but what was implied. His instructions did not come as decrees, but as interpretive guidelines, updates to internal policy, subtle shifts in focus. There was no need for brute enforcement when the entire network was tuned to respond like a single nervous system. Historians now speculate that many Inquisition cases, particularly in the latter phase, originated not from public outrage or ecclesiastical error, but from Jesuit observations. These were not necessarily accusations, but risk assessments. A professor's curious phrasing, a scholar's interest in comparative texts, a local priest's engagement with unapproved metaphysics, any of these could trigger quiet intervention, not to silence, but to correct, contain, or absorb. In such a system, theology becomes less about revelation and more about control of interpretation. The Jesuits understood that heresy does not begin with belief. It begins with a question. So, they built systems where the question would never arise. Classrooms were arranged, not by accident, to reward harmony. Textbooks were edited with strategic omissions. Dissent was not argued against, it was preemptively reframed, and when that failed, a student's career might stall, a paper be unpublished, an opportunity quietly passed over. The Inquisition no longer needed shackles. It had created a subtler cage consent shaped by fear of intellectual isolation. There are scattered accounts, letters, notes, discarded reports that suggest certain ideas were marked not as heretical, but as premature. The Jesuits did not always destroy dangerous thought. They sometimes archived it, studied it, and waited. What was unfit for the current structure might one day serve a future one. And so, behind the walls of silence, a second vault grew, not of relics, but of ideas. Suppressed not forever, but until needed. This vault was not physical, though pieces of it may remain in forgotten drawers or coded manuscripts. It was cognitive. A map of boundaries drawn not in ink, but inhabit. The Jesuits became guardians of that map, not to enforce it violently, but to update it silently. When the world shifted, so did the lines. A theological position once unthinkable might slowly become permissible, not because it had proven true, but because it had become useful. In this way, the Jesuits transformed the Inquisition from spectacle into system. They didn't need bonfires. They built consensus. They didn't require chains. They guided culture. And perhaps most unsettling of all, they did it not with malice, but with conviction. Their goal was not power for its own sake, but preservation of structure, of alignment, of mission. But structure without scrutiny becomes something else. It hardens. It repeats itself. It begins to justify its own preservation as virtue. And when that happens, truth is no longer sought. It is curated. Disagreements are not debated. They are erased before they appear. And those who sense the absence of freedom cannot prove it, because what is missing leaves no mark. This is the shadow legacy of the Jesuits in the intellectual sphere. Not censorship in the public sense, but orchestration of acceptability. They shaped the perimeter of permissible thought so precisely that even the most brilliant minds learned to thrive within it, unaware that they were not exploring, but echoing. The Black Pope, Superior General of the Jesuits, has always claimed no involvement in doctrinal policing. Yet his position oversees the very institutions where theological formation begins. And when one man shapes the minds that will later define orthodoxy, he does not need to burn books. He only needs to write the next generation's reading list. Even today, in seminaries, policy forums, and global ethics councils, the echoes remain, frameworks that guide what can be said, what is favored, what is quietly discouraged. No decree forbids certain topics. They simply recede, disappear, linger on the edge of discourse like fading memories of forbidden names. And so, when we remember the Inquisition, we picture fire. But that was only its overt face. The real architecture of control was colder. It wore no robe of terror, but of intellect. And its legacy lives not in the past, but in the way thought itself has been shaped ever since. So, the question lingers, not whether the Inquisition ended, but whether it ever needed to. What if it simply changed form? What if it no longer hunts individuals, but conditions ideas? What if the only reason we believe it is gone is because we have been trained not to notice its return? Across centuries and continents, empires rose with banners and fell beneath them. Kings were crowned and forgotten. Revolutions broke and healed. But one constant remained, a silent force expelled from over 80 nations, yet never dismantled. The Jesuits, at different moments in time, were cast out of France, Spain, Portugal, Russia, China, and even the Vatican itself. Each expulsion carried accusations of subversion, manipulation, or unchecked influence. But with each removal came something stranger. The Jesuits never fought back publicly. They simply disappeared, and then, over time, returned stronger than before. The sheer number of expulsions is staggering. In 1759, they were banished from Portugal, in 1764 from France, in 1767 from Spain and its colonies, and in 1773 under the pressure of European monarchies. Pope Clement X officially dissolved the order altogether. At the time, it was considered a death blow. But unlike other orders crushed by political tides, the Society of Jesus responded not with rebellion, but with quiet adaptation. Their institutions folded outward, not inward. Their ideas dispersed into other names, other robes, other roles, and their structure, though wounded, never unraveled. This resilience has long puzzled historians. How does a religious order, stripped of land, disbanded by papal decree, hunted by kings, survive with such coherence? The answer is buried not in doctrine, but in design. The Jesuits were never dependent on monasteries or cathedrals. Their true foundation was intellectual infrastructure, networks of education, influence, and alignment. They did not need territory. They needed minds. And minds travel. During their suppression, many Jesuits adopted civilian identities, entered academic circles, or operated in foreign lands under neutral banners. Their libraries were not burned. In many cases, they were hidden, safeguarded by sympathetic elites who understood the long game being played. Entire knowledge systems, maps, philosophical treatises, indigenous records, missionary analyses were quietly preserved, sometimes smuggled across borders under false cargo designations. This was not resistance, it was strategy. The silence was not surrender, it was survival. In this period of exile, something else happened, an evolution. The Jesuits learned not only how to endure, but how to operate without presence. When you are not allowed to appear, you become atmosphere. When institutions are denied, ideas take root instead. And by the time the Vatican restored the order in 1814, it was not calling back a defeated body. It was acknowledging a ghost that had never left. This restoration was not merely a theological correction. It was a recognition of need. The Enlightenment had fractured the Church's authority. Secularism had begun to challenge moral tradition. Political revolutions were redefining sovereignty and faith alike. The Vatican needed not just defenders of belief, but engineers of influence. And the Jesuits, shaped by suppression and tempered by exile, were prepared to become something even more refined, a decentralized intelligence system wearing the garments of service. From that moment onward, the Jesuits became harder to track, no longer confined to clear lines of authority. They diversified. Some ran schools, others advised political leaders, some re-entered missionary fields, others worked quietly within think tanks and research institutions. But always, their activity shared the same rhythm: intellectual alignment, strategic presence, and absolute coordination with the superior general. The map no longer mattered. The network did. This shift in identity, from order to system, made them nearly untouchable. Nations could outlaw institutions, but not minds. Laws could dismantle buildings, but not erase influence. The Jesuits learned to function not as a visible body, but as an invisible current, one that adapted to every political climate, every ideological terrain. And in this way, expulsion became evolution. Consider South America, where Jesuit missions had once flourished before being dismantled by imperial decree. When Spanish and Portuguese forces reclaimed those regions, they found indigenous communities organized not by feudal law, but by Jesuit logic, self-contained, agriculturally independent, and intellectually structured. Even after the priests were removed, their imprint remained. Entire villages still followed liturgical calendars, sang hymns in native dialects, and debated ethics with more clarity than many European courts. The architecture of thought had survived the collapse of presence. Elsewhere, former Jesuit educators quietly integrated into royal academies, contributing to sciences, philosophy, and jurisprudence. Their names appeared less frequently on church rolls, but more often in foundational texts of modern institutions. And while their affiliation to the society remained unspoken, the patterns of their thinking traced unmistakably to Jesuit formation. Once again, the order had not been erased. It had become dispersed. This dispersal gave rise to another form of presence, embedded influence, in governments, courts, universities, and publishing houses. Former Jesuits or Jesuit-trained individuals occupied positions that shaped policy, curriculum, and public opinion. They did not act in concert, they did not need to. The formative logic of the order had already been imprinted. And when the need arose, alignment could be re-established through a single memorandum, a strategic shift in institutional language, or a subtle adjustment in regional policy. Critics saw this as infiltration, but that word implies deception. What occurred was more sophisticated, a long-standing process of ideological cultivation. The society had trained its members to think in systems, to read power not as domination, but as orchestration. So, when opportunity returned, they did not rebuild, they resumed. To this day, the question remains unanswered: how can an order exiled by so many, feared by monarchs, silenced by popes, remain not only intact, but ascendant? The answer may lie in the very nature of disappearance. Most powers collapse when expelled, because their identity is tied to visibility. But when visibility is never the point, expulsion becomes meaningless. The Jesuits were designed to vanish. Their power lies in what survives the vanishing. This is the paradox of suppression. The more the Jesuits were feared, the more essential they became. The more they were attacked, the more flexible their form. And in every instance, when the world thought them defeated, they re-emerged, not as relics, but as architects of the next structure. Perhaps that is why their logo, the IHS Sunburst, appears so often not as a beacon, but as a watermark, faint, hidden, etched into stone above doors, woven into the crest of universities, lingering behind the insignias of agencies and councils. Never declared, yet always present. So, what does it mean when an organization survives 80 expulsions? What does it mean when suppression only spreads its roots? And what if the very act of banishment, meant to destroy, was instead the final stage of a design older than the empires that sought to erase it? Wars are usually remembered through noise, explosions, flags, cries of victory or surrender. But the Jesuits have always operated in the intervals between such sounds. While generals drew maps and armies clashed in fields of ruin, the Society of Jesus moved in silence, positioning ideas instead of battalions, shaping the long arc of belief while the world was distracted by fire. They understood that real power is not seized in moments of chaos. It is built slowly, invisibly, in the minds of those who will inherit the ashes. During the great religious conflicts of the 16th and 17th centuries, when Europe was engulfed in theological warfare, the Jesuits did not retreat into prayer. They marched, not with weapons, but with syllabi. In Protestant territories, they opened schools. In Catholic strongholds, they advised kings. They translated ancient texts, debated in public forums, taught astronomy, architecture, law. But always beneath the surface, their presence carried a deeper mission to influence the outcome not of the current generation, but of the next. In France, Jesuit educators became tutors to the heirs of noble houses, including members of the Bourbon dynasty. They did not preach rebellion or loyalty. They taught persuasion. In Spain, they became confessors to monarchs, quiet listeners to sovereign doubts, subtle counselors shaping policies through the whisper of conscience. In Austria and Poland, they operated in courts and universities, not demanding control but providing something more enduring frameworks. Every region they entered, they adapted, not by compromising their purpose, but by mastering local codes. In Japan, they learned court etiquette and wore silk robes. In China, they presented themselves as scholars of the stars. Their theology was never softened. It was translated philosophically, culturally, politically. They didn't tear down temples. They entered them with questions, and by the time they left, the conversation had changed. This approach, often called inculturation, was not innovation, it was strategy. To enter a system without disturbing its structure, to insert new premises where no argument was expected. And in doing so, they shifted belief not by confrontation, but by internal evolution. This was not conquest, it was conversion through cognition. Over time, governments began to notice something unsettling. The Jesuits left behind no armies. They built no forts, yet their influence remained longer than any occupying force. A territory might resist foreign flags, but not foreign ideas once they took root in the schools, the courts, the conversations of its leaders. And because these ideas wore the mask of reason, science, and improvement, they were rarely rejected outright. This persistence sparked suspicion. Monarchs began to see the Jesuits not as humble priests, but as architects of subtle loyalty. Loyalty not to crown or creed, but to something unspoken, distant, unified, a system without borders, a network without flags, and at its center, a voice no king could summon, no court could subpoena the superior general. This fear became action. In Portugal, Prime Minister Pombal ordered the mass expulsion of Jesuits, claiming they were undermining royal authority through education. In France, the Parliament accused them of infiltrating the bureaucracy. In Spain, their missions were dismantled, their properties seized. But even as their bodies were removed, the residue of their ideas remained. Young nobles still quoted Jesuit teachings. Ministers still thought in Jesuit logic. The shape of conversation did not change, only the actors. This raised an uncomfortable question: could influence persist without presence? Could loyalty outlast expulsion? Could thought itself become a kind of silent empire? An empire where the flag is a worldview, and allegiance is measured not by confession, but by how a man interprets the world. The Jesuits believed it could, and their method of achieving it was simple: plant deeply, water quietly, retreat when necessary, and let time do the rest. They understood that the most dangerous power is not the one that imposes itself. It is the one that shapes the conditions in which others make their own decisions, never realizing those decisions were anticipated. In many cases, even those shaped by Jesuit education did not realize the depth of their formation. They remembered discipline, rhetoric, clarity. They admired their former instructors, but they did not always recognize the architecture beneath their own reasoning. That was by design. Jesuit pedagogy was never about indoctrination. It was about formation, to make a man capable of leading, thinking, adapting, and in doing so, to embed a kind of mental signature, an echo of the order's original logic. This is how the Jesuits remained in the game of empires long after being removed from the board, not by returning visibly, but by being too deeply rooted to extract. Monarchies might collapse, republics might rise, revolutions might burn old systems to the ground. But if the minds leading those revolutions had once sat in Jesuit classrooms, then the order's influence continued, quietly, effectively, invisibly. Even today, this legacy endures, across continents, in parliaments and palaces, in courtrooms and universities. There are those whose formative years were shaped under Jesuit guidance. They may no longer wear the language of the Church. They may claim secular titles. But the clarity with which they organize thought, the discipline with which they debate, the measured cadence of their persuasion, all reflect the same formation. And this raises a final question when history measures power. It often looks for armies, laws, declarations. But what if the truest power lies elsewhere, not in possession, but in permission, not in conquest, but in consensus, not in the ability to rule, but in the ability to form those who will. When the sails of empire cut across the oceans in search of gold and glory, not all who boarded those ships carried weapons. Among soldiers and explorers, another figure moved silently through the hold, dressed in black, carrying no sword, holding instead a crucifix and a notebook. He was not there to conquer, but to observe, record, and slowly reorganize the soul of the unknown. The Jesuit missionary did not build fortresses. He built missions. He did not claim land. He reshaped belief. And over time, entire continents would remember his voice more than the generals who paved the way. In the Americas, The Jesuits arrived alongside the Spanish and Portuguese, but their mission was not imperial in the usual sense. They were not agents of the crown, though they often worked parallel to it. Instead, they created parallel societies, small, controlled experiments in civilization called reducciones. These settlements gathered indigenous populations into structured communities governed not by European law, but by Jesuit principle. The goal was not assimilation through violence, but reformation through presence. To outside observers, these communities appeared peaceful. There were no prisons, no private property. Education was universal. Music filled the air. Rituals followed the rhythms of the liturgical year. At first glance, they seemed like utopian sanctuaries, immune to the brutality that plagued other colonial fronts. But a closer look reveals a more complex picture, one where dignity was preached, but obedience was expected, where salvation was offered, but only through absolute submission to Jesuit governance. Within the reducciones, the Jesuits controlled nearly every aspect of life: work schedules, spiritual formation, education, agriculture, architecture. They designed the calendar. They curated belief. The native language was preserved in part, but only as a bridge to catechism. Conversion was not forced, yet opting out meant isolation. Over generations, original identities faded, not through violence, but through repetition. What the Jesuits created was not a colony. It was a model, a prototype of society grounded in religious unity, economic equality, and intellectual control. And though it was cloaked in compassion, it functioned with extraordinary efficiency. Trade was regulated, resources were pooled, labor was coordinated for the collective good, but always under the authority of the priests, who reported not to colonial governors, but to the superior general in Rome. The scale of this operation was immense. By the mid-18th century, hundreds of missions had been established across Paraguay, Argentina, Brazil, and beyond. Tens of thousands of indigenous people lived under Jesuit care. They were taught to read, to farm, to pray. But they were also taught to distrust their ancestral ways, to forget old gods, to speak through new metaphors. The transformation was gradual, almost invisible, until it was complete. For the Spanish and Portuguese crowns, this growing autonomy became a threat. These missions, though technically within imperial borders, did not answer to local viceroys. They formed a network loyal to Rome, but governed by a system even the Vatican sometimes struggled to control. Indigenous populations began to identify more with Jesuit priests than with monarchs, and the economic self-sufficiency of these communities meant fewer taxes, less labor for colonial projects, and a growing unease about who truly ruled the interior. In 1767, under pressure from the Bourbon monarchs, King Charles III of Spain ordered the expulsion of all Jesuits from his territories. In a single night, missions were shut down. Priests were arrested or deported. Communities that had thrived for generations were absorbed into colonial systems that neither understood nor cared for their prior structure. Chaos followed, and yet, the most critical element of the Jesuit plan had already been preserved. Before their departure, Jesuit leaders enacted a quiet operation. Records, maps, linguistic studies, architectural plans, agricultural strategies, everything developed in the missions were meticulously copied, sealed, and shipped back to Europe. Some were stored in private collections, others hidden in libraries known only to a few. They understood that knowledge was more enduring than territory, and that if the reducciones were destroyed, the idea behind them would still remain, waiting. What these documents contain remains a mystery. Some have been studied, others vanished. There are rumors of codices describing advanced irrigation methods, cross-cultural psychology, encoded dialectic systems, even political theories derived from indigenous governance blended with Jesuit theology. Whether true or embellished, the very existence of such archives raises an uncomfortable thought: the Jesuits may have left South America, but they took its mind with them. In modern discourse, these missions are often remembered as humanitarian sanctuaries, and in some respects, they were. Lives were preserved. Violence was reduced, but the cost was not only cultural, it was ontological. Entire generations were taught to see their world through an imported lens, their mythology reframed, their ancestors redefined, their history rewritten, not by force, but by education, ritual, and a form of love that demanded erasure before acceptance. This method, gentle control cloaked in devotion, proved far more sustainable than colonial conquest. And long after the armies retreated, the logic of the missions continued to echo. In remote villages, hymns still bear Jesuit melodies. In civic structures, the communal layouts mirror mission blueprints. And in the worldview of former colonies, a certain pattern of thought remains, deferential to hierarchy, reverent towards centralized wisdom, shaped by a moral geometry not native, but deeply embedded. The Society of Jesus did not merely evangelize the New World, they extracted it, not its gold, but its narrative. And in doing so, they revealed a deeper principle, one that transcends geography. Whoever controls the story controls the future, and whoever preserves the documents, even in exile, holds the map back to the center. So, the question lingers. What lies in those sealed archives, buried in monasteries, Vatican vaults, or private European collections? Were the reducciones simply experiments in piety, or something far more ambitious? A prototype for a civilization where belief, labor, governance, and identity all fold into a single structure, directed not by force, but by a vow that erases the will and rewrites it under another name. To understand the Jesuit presence in Asia is to witness a different kind of conquest, one that did not seek to overpower, but to embed. The New World was vulnerable, open, destabilized by foreign disease and fractured authority. But the East held no such weakness. China and Japan were ancient civilizations with structured cosmologies, sophisticated languages, and rulers who did not bow easily to imported gods. There, the Jesuits could not lead with scripture. They had to arrive with something more persuasive: knowledge. When Matteo Ricci entered China in the late 16th century, he did not wear his priestly robes. He dressed as a Confucian scholar. He did not preach of sin and salvation. He offered calendars, star charts, and mechanical clocks. In an empire where harmony was tied to celestial order, Jesuit astronomy became a key of entry. The emperor's court admired precision, and Ricci provided it. His maps impressed, his manners matched the elite. And before long, the Jesuits were not only tolerated, they were invited to advise. The same strategy unfolded in Japan. Early missionaries like Francis Xavier gained tens of thousands of converts, particularly among the warrior class. But as unification efforts under the Tokugawa shogunate progressed, Christianity was seen as a potential threat, foreign influence disguised as faith. Persecutions followed. Missionaries were tortured, executed, driven underground. Yet, even in hiding, the Jesuits remained. They taught in whispers. They printed texts in secret. They formed cells of believers who practiced in silence for decades, sustained not by ritual, but by memory. This form of adaptation, stepping into foreign systems, speaking their language, earning trust through intellect, became a defining feature of Jesuit missions in the East. They did not ask empires to change. They studied them, mirrored them, and then offered a revised version of their own design, subtle, respectful, but structurally transformative. The goal was not to replace, but to refract. In China, Jesuits contributed to calendar reform, mapped eclipses with Western accuracy, and helped align imperial rituals with astronomical precision. They advised on architecture, city planning, even river management. Their influence grew not through numbers, but through access. Few converted, but many listened. And in the elite courts of the Ming and Qing dynasties, listening was often more powerful than belief. Jesuit writings in Chinese were meticulously crafted. Theological concepts were translated through local philosophy. Jesus was presented not as a foreign savior, but as a sage in harmony with the Tao. The Trinity was framed within metaphysical triads familiar to Confucian discourse. There was no dilution, only reframing. The result was not mass conversion, but philosophical bridge building. And in those bridges, the Jesuits walked farther than any army could. But this influence came with risk. Their success drew envy. Other orders accused them of syncretism. Traditionalists in Rome feared compromise. In 1704, Pope Clement XVI banned the Jesuit approach to Chinese rites, declaring them incompatible with Christian orthodoxy. The emperor, offended, expelled the missionaries. What had been a golden corridor of cultural exchange collapsed, and yet, the knowledge remained. The science, the language, the frameworks introduced, none of it vanished. Chinese astronomers continued using Jesuit calculations. Scholars still read their texts. And in the deeper layers of imperial governance, their logic endured. Once again, even when presence was revoked, imprint remained. The empire did not convert, but part of its intellectual DNA was quietly rewritten. This pattern repeated in Vietnam, India, Korea, and parts of Southeast Asia. The Jesuits entered not as conquerors, but as advisors. They offered medicine, mathematics, diplomacy. In return, they received access, sometimes fleeting, sometimes generational. And in those fleeting windows, they planted something more lasting than belief. They planted method. They documented everything: political systems, agricultural patterns, dialects, myths, social customs. Jesuit archives from Asia contain not only missionary reports, but entire cultural atlases. Some are still housed in European libraries, others remain unpublished. Their value lies not only in their data, but in what they suggest: a map of how civilizations could be understood, influenced, and restructured from within. Even their failures were instructive. When the rights controversy closed doors in China, it taught the order a bitter lesson about visibility. Influence must always be 2 steps ahead of doctrine. Adaptation must never outpace authorization. From that moment, Jesuit strategy evolved further, becoming more discreet, more modular, more resilient. Their presence in Asia shifted from courts to classrooms, from temples to textbooks. In modern times, this influence echoes in unexpected places. Jesuit universities in the Philippines, India, Japan, and Indonesia continue to educate political leaders, scientists, and philosophers. Their curricula blend Western methodology with local heritage. Their graduates speak the language of global ethics and governance. And though few identify as religious emissaries, their frameworks of thought still reflect a specific lineage, a lineage traced back to those early missionaries who wore robes of silk and carried charts of stars. This is the hidden architecture of Jesuit strategy: not to dominate, but to embed; not to overthrow, but to orient; to enter through respect; to adapt the message without diluting its intent; and to influence from within until the host system cannot distinguish between its original logic and the one newly seated inside it. So, when we study Jesuit missions in Asia, we must ask not how many were baptized, but how many were reshaped; not how long they stayed, but how deep they reached; and perhaps, most unsettling of all, How much of what we now call modern Asian philosophy, science, or governance still carries the soft echo of a black-robed stranger who once stood beneath a celestial chart, smiled gently, and offered not a sermon, but a solution? In the heat of revolution, when barricades rise and ideologies clash, the world looks for visible agents of change, leaders with slogans, protesters with fire, regimes collapsing under pressure. But revolutions rarely emerge from chaos alone. They are often preceded by something quieter, years of formation, of ideas seeded long before the streets erupt. And within those origins, again and again, a subtle presence is found. Jesuits, positioned not in the center of action, but at its periphery, educators of rebels, confessors to kings, silent observers in times of fracture. Throughout the 18th and 19th centuries, as monarchies weakened and empires trembled beneath the weight of enlightenment and populism, Jesuit influence did not recede, it shifted. In Latin America, newly independent nations emerged from the wreckage of colonial rule. And as power structures reorganized, a question lingered. Who would guide the moral compass of these republics now freed from crown and church? In many cases, it was those formed in Jesuit classrooms, men who spoke of liberty with conviction, shaped not by accident, but by design. Consider Chile, where Jesuit-educated thinkers played key roles in the intellectual foundations of the nation. Or Argentina, where future leaders sat in schools built by the order, absorbing not only mathematics and rhetoric, but structured thought and calibrated argument. These men would later write constitutions, draft economic policy, advise generals, and though their titles changed, the signature remained strategy wrapped in humility, influence masked as service, vision grounded in long memory. This pattern was not limited to South America. In Europe, revolutions spread like fire across borders. In France, the Ancien regime crumbled beneath the weight of inequality, but also beneath centuries of tension between ecclesiastical power and secular yearning. Yet, within these shifting dynamics, former Jesuits and Jesuit-educated minds found roles on both sides, some defending tradition, others crafting the framework of republics. In either case, their influence did not declare allegiance. It guided systems. This dual positioning, simultaneously present and elusive, caused unease among rulers and revolutionaries alike. They asked, how could one institution produce both reformers and traditionalists? How could its alumni fight on both sides of a civil war, yet echo the same tone of discipline, clarity, and moral structure? The answer was never ideological. It was architectural. The Society of Jesus did not teach what to think. It taught how to think, within a specific set of contours, a logic that prioritized order, discernment, and strategic action. That framework was perfectly suited for unstable times. When nations fractured, when power vacuums opened, those trained to navigate complexity were suddenly indispensable. And so, even as the Church's formal influence waned in certain regions, the Jesuits remained behind the scenes, not as priests, but as advisors, counselors, and policymakers. They did not carry flags, they carried patterns. In the early 20th century, as the world careened toward mechanized war, this pattern deepened. The rise of fascism, socialism, and liberal democracy created a landscape of ideological extremes. But amid the shouting, certain voices remained calm, educated, articulate, influential. Many had roots in Jesuit academies, where political labels were secondary to strategic thought. They spoke in full paragraphs. They built coalitions, not mobs. They appeared on both sides of history, yet rarely outside its frame. Some might call this opportunism, others call it survival. But in truth, it was something else: positioning. The Jesuits understood that revolutions are not won by slogans. They are shaped by those who design the aftermath. And to influence the reconstruction of society, One must be present before the collapse, not to incite, but to observe, not to command, but to prepare. In Nicaragua, the Sandinista movement drew upon liberation theology, a school of thought infused with Jesuit moral philosophy. In El Salvador, Jesuit priests were martyred during civil conflict, not because they were rebels, but because their advocacy for justice was seen as subversive. In Colombia, the order maintained educational institutions while guerrilla warfare raged nearby. In all these places, their presence was layered spiritual on the surface, infrastructural beneath. Their strategy during revolutions mirrors their broader design. They build slowly, deliberately, without demanding recognition. They cultivate loyalty not through indoctrination, but through intellectual formation. And when the winds of politics shift, they adapt, not by changing their essence, but by changing their expression. It is a form of influence immune to regime change, because it does not depend on the regime. It flows beneath it. This is why so many dictatorships have both feared and relied upon Jesuit-trained elites. These individuals, even when stripped of clerical titles, carry the ability to organize thought, manage institutions, and speak in a tone that calms public unrest. They do not speak the language of charisma, they speak the language of systems, and in moments of collapse, that language becomes a stabilizing force. But this duality breeds questions. When Jesuits stand beside rebels and rulers alike, what do they truly serve when their institutions survive both fascism and revolution? Are they guardians of truth or simply of continuity? And when their silence endures through every upheaval, is it wisdom or design? The truth may lie in the mechanics of formation. Jesuit education is not about loyalty to power, but to a framework, one that values discernment, control, and calculated influence. As such, those trained within it may serve wildly different masters, yet apply the same methods. One may rise as a populist, another as a technocrat, but both trace their tools to the same forge. This is why, in the aftermath of revolutions, we often find the society's fingerprints, not in manifestos or flag, but in laws, institutions, and language. They shape what is rebuilt. They guide how it is remembered. They influence not the explosion, but the echo. So, when a regime falls and a new flag is raised, and textbooks are rewritten, ask not who marched in the streets. Ask who wrote the first line of the new Constitution. Ask who trained the man who drafted the economic model. Ask who whispered the vocabulary of reconciliation into the ears of those who would lead both sides. And in that whisper, you may find not a name, but a method. And that method may still bear the seal of a vow taken long ago, far from battlefields, in a chamber where the only sound was the silence of formation. Some disappearances are loud, surrounded by speculation and scandal. Others slip through history like whispers, quiet, surgical, never fully explained. On the night of September 28, 1978, Pope John Paul I was found dead in his private chambers, just 33 days after his election. There were no signs of violence, no confirmed illnesses, no forewarning. Official reports cited a heart attack. No autopsy was performed. No investigation was opened. Within hours, the world moved on, soothed by ritual and tradition. But behind the veil of ceremony, a deeper silence began to echo, a silence too sharp to be coincidence. Pope John Paul. I had come to the papacy with a reputation for reform, humble in demeanor, direct in intention. He had begun quietly reviewing the Vatican's entanglements, particularly its financial structures, the opaque operations of the Vatican Bank, and its rumored connections to clandestine organizations operating beneath the surface of church decorum. He spoke of transparency, he spoke of cleansing, and then he ceased to speak at all, Theories swirled, none proven, none erased. Among them, one name returned again and again, not shouted, not accused, but quietly inferred: the Jesuits. Not as murderers, not as villains, but as part of the architecture behind the curtain. Because within the complex machinery of the Vatican, there exists not only one chain of command, but many. And when those chains become entangled, when agendas cross and loyalties divide, resolution does not come through public debate. It comes through erasure. John Paul. I was reportedly preparing a list, a set of removals, transfers, and restructurings to be announced in the following days. Key positions were under review, some of them held by figures educated, advised, or surrounded by members of the society. He intended, it is said, to sever connections between the Vatican Bank and shadow financial institutions, long suspected of laundering funds, financing covert operations, and managing dark money for ends unknown. And perhaps that was the moment his fate was sealed. In the hours before his death, several aides claimed to have seen him deeply focused, reading through documents, making notes. The next morning, he was found seated upright, spectacles on, a book open in his lap. There was no struggle, only stillness. His passing was declared natural, the cause unchallenged. But to those who knew the rhythm of Vatican affairs, something in that stillness rang too precise, as if the moment had been composed. What makes this episode more than mere speculation is not the absence of evidence, but the patterns surrounding it. Whenever deep reform threatens structural interests, not just theological, but economic, strategic, transnational, the resistance does not always emerge through force. It appears through delay, through obfuscation, and sometimes through the quiet vanishing of momentum. And within such patterns, the most dangerous force is not opposition, but silence. The Jesuits have long denied involvement. No documents link them directly. No testimony accuses them outright. But their position in the Vatican is unique. They do not operate within the same visible hierarchy. Their loyalty flows through a parallel structure, one that can support, influence, or stall decisions without ever raising its voice. When something shifts inside the Church, when momentum changes direction, it is often difficult to trace whether it was pushed or merely allowed to fall. In the wake of John Paul I's death, his intended reforms faded. The list he had been preparing vanished. His successor, John Paul II, inherited the throne with a different tone, one more diplomatic, more enduring. And within this new order, certain connections remained untouched. The Vatican Bank was never fully opened. Its entanglements remained buried beneath layers of sovereign immunity, financial opacity, and sacred discretion. What makes this story linger is not the possibility of foul play, but the architecture that allows such possibilities to vanish unexamined. The Church is, by nature, an institution of ritual. It seeks closure, not uncertainty. But beneath that surface lies another instinct, the preservation of structure. And when that structure is threatened, the mechanisms of protection do not flash, they dim. Jesuit influence within these mechanisms is never direct, it is systemic. Their members sit on advisory boards. They guide theological interpretation. They frame questions in a way that leads discussions away from danger and toward containment. When controversy arises, it is managed with precision. And when a threat to the inner equilibrium appears, it is often met with preemption, not confrontation. This is the true machinery of control, not visible command, but invisible calibration, to manage risk before it manifests, to redirect inquiry before it becomes rebellion, and when necessary, to allow disappearance to wear the face of natural order. The death of Pope John Paul remains one of the Vatican's most persistent enigmas, not because the facts are hidden, but because the questions are unasked. And those who do ask find themselves faced not with denial, but with absence. No files, no records, only remembrance, scattered reports, and the occasional mention in books quickly dismissed as speculative. But in every system where information is suppressed not by censorship, but by structure, the absence itself becomes a signal. And those trained to read such signals, those who understand how power moves beneath liturgy, can trace the shape of intent not in statements, but in the shadowed spaces between them. So what do we make of a pope who lived 33 days, who sought to clean what others would rather keep untouched, who read late into the night and did not wake to write again? Perhaps nothing, perhaps everything. Perhaps his death was natural, unfortunate, untimely. Or perhaps it was something else, a silent resolution to an invisible conflict, buried beneath 1,000 prayers. If the Jesuits were involved, it will never be proven. If they weren't, their influence still played its role, not in action, but in architecture. For in a system so layered, so silent, and so perfectly insulated, the line between coincidence and orchestration fades. And in that fading lies a lesson darker than any accusation. That true power needs no spectacle. It requires only silence, timing, and a world trained not to ask the question that won't be answered. Beneath every oath, every uniform, and every public title, there is always a deeper contract, unwritten, unspoken, but unbreakable. For the Jesuits, that contract reaches its most complete form in the final stages of formation. It is there, after years of spiritual exercises, intellectual refinement, and emotional detachment, that the last vow is made. Not a vow to teach, to serve, or even to defend the faith, but a vow to obey. Absolutely, without hesitation, without question, without self. This obedience is not symbolic, it is structural. It is the lever by which the society moves with one will, through many bodies. And that will flows upward, not to God directly, nor to the Pope, but to the superior general. He is not simply a figurehead. He is the central node in a vast organism, one that does not wait for public consensus before it acts, one that does not require approval before it moves. His voice, within the order, is not considered advisory. It is final. The language used in Jesuit training documents avoids theatricality, but the implications are precise. The Jesuit must become indifferent to his own desires, detached from personal opinions, and wholly receptive to mission. He must be prepared to go where he is told, when he is told, and do what is required, whether that mission is in the heart of a metropolis or in the shadow of war. The phrase used often in their texts is chilling in its clarity: perinde et si cadaver, to obey like a corpse. This mindset is not unique to military structures, but in a religious context, it carries a particular weight. It transforms the priest from individual into instrument. His agency is not lost, it is offered, and once offered, it is repurposed, to think not as one, but as many, to move not from conviction, but from coordination. Throughout history, this model has enabled the Jesuits to act with unprecedented reach. Their members have entered war zones, infiltrated regimes, advised revolutionaries, and counseled tyrants. Not always with the same goal, not always with the same ideology, but always with the same discipline. The mission changes. The method does not. There are reports, some confirmed, others buried in ambiguity, of Jesuit agents operating within volatile regions under assumed identities, not as spies, but as silencers of instability. Their role was not to confront, but to stabilize, to reshape from within. In some cases, this meant mediating conflict. In others, it meant guiding the outcome before the first bullet was fired. The oath allows for such flexibility. Once the individual's will is dissolved, the command structure can adapt him to any context. He may serve as a professor, a journalist, a humanitarian worker. But beneath each role lies the same thread alignment to the superior general's intent. That intent is rarely stated plainly. It arrives in tone, in emphasis, in regional assignments that form a pattern when viewed from high enough above. What this creates is a global network of operatives who do not act as drones, but as orchestrated intellects. They are thinkers, not automatons, but their thought is shaped within a narrow corridor, reinforced by spiritual practice and communal ideology. Each carries within him a kind of invisible compass, one that does not point north, but toward purpose. The most controversial aspect of this structure is not its obedience, but its invisibility. Jesuit operations do not declare themselves. Their members do not wear distinguishing garments once embedded. Their movements are not tracked through military channels, and yet they are present. In negotiation rooms, in academic councils, in relief efforts that double as data collection platforms. Some intelligence agencies, quietly, refer to the Jesuits as the invisible grid. Because while other organizations require tools, surveillance, or weapons, the Jesuits require only access, and access, when combined with loyalty, becomes influence. Influence, when sustained over time, becomes control. In regions where open control is impossible, soft presence becomes the alternative. A Jesuit school in a rural province may educate the next decade's policymakers. A charitable initiative may collect not just needs, but sentiments. A university curriculum may shift national identity without touching the ballot box. None of these actions are illegal, but together, they form a network of narrative design. This power is amplified by the internal surveillance the order imposes on itself. Every Jesuit is trained to reflect constantly, to examine his own deviation, to report his own failures before others do. In this way, dissent is neutralized before it can echo. The structure remains not because it is enforced from above, but because it is sustained from within. The superior general, then, does not rule through fear. He guides through infrastructure. Every decision is filtered through layers of formation, regional councils, silent affirmation. And when deviation threatens the balance, it is corrected not by punishment, but by reassignment, a transfer here, a sabbatical there, a redirection that allows the network to continue unbroken, unexposed. This system is not infallible. It has faced crises, exposure, scandal, but its strength lies in its elasticity. It does not snap, it bends, absorbs the shock, and reforms itself quietly. Like water changing vessels, it adapts its strategy without altering its essence. And in doing so, it survives when louder powers fall. To outsiders, the oath may appear excessive, even fanatical, but to those inside, it is the foundation of everything. Without it, there is no unity. Without unity, there is no mission. And without mission, the society ceases to be a body. It becomes fragments. The oath, it then, is not a chain. It is the spine. So, when the world asks how the Jesuits maintain influence across centuries, continents, and regimes, the answer does not lie in politics or theology. It lies in this singular commitment, an obedience so complete, so internalized, that it allows thousands to move as one, to wait without fatigue, to act without delay, and to vanish without a trace when the mission ends. And perhaps that is the most unsettling truth of all, that a man can live, work, speak, and serve in full view of the world, yet belong entirely to something else, something older, quieter, and more determined than anyone watching could ever guess. When colonial fleets carved their way across oceans in search of wealth and dominion, they left behind ruins, borders, and broken sovereignties. But the Jesuits, walking in their wake, left something else, order. Not the order of empire, with its muskets and flags, but a subtler symmetry built into memory. In South America, particularly in the heartlands of Paraguay, Brazil, and northern Argentina, this symmetry still lingers. Though the missions have long since vanished, the blueprint they established remains, etched not in stone, but in the behaviors, beliefs, and rhythms of those who once lived beneath Jesuit eyes. The reducciones, often romanticized as enlightened sanctuaries, were more than settlements. They were social laboratories. Entire communities of indigenous people were brought together under Jesuit supervision, not enslaved, but also not free. Private property was abolished. Time was measured by bells and prayer. Labor was divided with mathematical efficiency. Education was universal, but guided strictly by catechism. Music flourished, art was encouraged, and agriculture was optimized. On the surface, it was harmony. Beneath it, control. The Jesuits did not exploit through violence. They governed through design. Every path in a mission town was measured. Every ritual was scheduled. Every life was placed within a pattern that slowly rewrote indigenous identity, not by erasing it, but by recontextualizing it under the framework of salvation. Language remained, but its metaphors changed. Myth became parable. Ancestors became echoes. And as each generation passed through Jesuit instruction, the distance from their original worldview widened, so subtly that few noticed until it was irreversible. This strategy worked because it was not framed as domination. It was presented as protection. The Jesuits claimed to shield natives from colonial abuses, to preserve their dignity through guided civilization, and in many respects, they did. Their missions were often havens from the brutality of European overlords, but with protection came loyalty, and with loyalty came a redirection of reverence, from ancestral spirits to Rome, from tribal councils to the priests, from oral traditions to the liturgy. The Jesuits did not conquer, they substituted. As the missions grew, so did their autonomy. The communities began to thrive economically. Their trade in timber, salt, and cattle rivaled colonial outputs. Their self-sufficiency became a point of tension. The indigenous no longer relied on colonial authorities. They deferred to the priests. And the priests, though technically under Vatican jurisdiction, answered directly to the superior general, not the king. This independence was tolerated until it wasn't. In 1767, under mounting pressure, King Charles III of Spain ordered the expulsion of all Jesuits from his dominions. The order was swift. Missions were emptied. Priests were deported. And the communities they had built were absorbed into colonial systems that had neither the discipline nor the reverence of the Jesuit model. The transition was not smooth. Indigenous populations scattered. Some resisted, others vanished into the margins of empire. Yet the most significant act occurred not in the fields or plazas, but in the archives. Before their departure, the Jesuits systematically copied and secured thousands of documents, linguistic records, agricultural plans, architectural diagrams, spiritual manuals, and ethnographic studies. These were not souvenirs. They were data. They were the intellectual skeleton of an entire parallel civilization, gathered and smuggled back to Europe, hidden in monasteries, or sealed within Vatican vaults. Some of these archives have since surfaced: partial inventories in Rome, handwritten grammars in Lisbon, agricultural treatises in Madrid, but many remain inaccessible. Whether locked away intentionally or forgotten in shadowed corners, their silence speaks loudly. These records represent a cartography not just of land, but of how human minds were reshaped. And in that reshaping lies a blueprint for control far more enduring than any imperial edict. What knowledge did the Jesuits extract during their time in South America? What models of governance, social cohesion, and spiritual alignment did they record? Models based not on coercion, but on willing assimilation. What did they learn about influence when exercised through love, structure, and song rather than through violence. These questions linger not because the evidence is absent, but because its implications are vast. Imagine a file containing the behavioral evolution of an entire population over 5 generations, documented by those who engineered it. Imagine a record of how belief systems can be softened, redirected, and reformulated without ever appearing to be erased. That is what some believe the Jesuit archives contain. Not just theology or history, but methodology. The secret formula for crafting obedience through care. If such documents were ever made public, they would not read like revelations. They would read like blueprints, charts of influence, timelines of adaptation, studies in the gentle alchemy of cultural transformation. And for those seeking to understand how ideas become structures, and structures become systems, such documents would be invaluable, not as history, but as instruction. The question then becomes, who controls that instruction now? Who holds the keys to the vaults where these blueprints sleep? And if they are not lost, are they being used again, refined and redeployed in modern contexts under new names, in new missions, wearing the costume of humanitarianism or education? In remote villages, echoes of the missions remain, in the shape of community gatherings, in the rhythm of local festivals, in the collective memory of those who recall ancestors not as warriors, but as choir singers. The traces are faint, but they align with the pattern. Once the pattern is known, it cannot be unseen. And perhaps that is the most unsettling legacy of the Jesuits in the New World. Not that they came with swords, but that they didn't need them. Not that they erased, but that they replaced so thoroughly the replacement feels like memory. And long after the buildings fall, the bells rust, and the priests are gone. The rhythm continues, measured, balanced, whispering a logic crafted not by empires, but by men who believed they were serving something higher, even as they reshaped the ground beneath their feet. Maps lie, not because of what they show, but because of what they omit. Every border drawn leaves something outside. Every place named suggests a narrative, a control, a purpose. And yet, some maps contain traces of older intentions, routes that are no longer spoken of, corridors that once carried people, objects, and ideas no government acknowledged. Among these hidden paths, one network stands above the rest, not defined by trade, conquest, or empire, but by something more chilling, escape. A trail formed in the aftermath of war, carved not through diplomacy, but through silence. They called it the Rat Lines. After the fall of Nazi Germany in 1945, hundreds of high-ranking officers, intelligence agents, and scientists vanished from public record. Some were killed, some were captured, but many, too many, simply disappeared. No trace, no tribunal, no graves, and yet, within a few years, they resurfaced in South America, in the Middle East, in remote provinces and bustling capitals, often under new names, with new documents, but familiar faces. These men, responsible for atrocities beyond description, had escaped, not by luck, but through corridors protected by institutions few would dare accuse. Among them, the Church. And within the Church, whispers pointed toward the Jesuits. The Rat Lines were not official, no government declared them, but the infrastructure required for such an operation, false passports, safe houses, funding, legal cover, did not appear by chance. Monasteries in Austria, Italy, and Spain were quietly repurposed. Priests signed forms as spiritual sponsors. Red Cross travel documents were issued with almost mechanical approval. And from the Vatican, messages passed, not through radio, but through hand-delivered notes, diplomatic pouches, and private counsel. The fugitives boarded ships under new names. And when they disembarked in Argentina, Brazil, or Paraguay, they were met not by agents, but by clergy. Some argue the Church acted from mercy, that even the guilty deserve redemption, that these men, stripped of uniform and power, were souls in need of saving. But others see calculation, a Cold War looming, the communist tide rising, and in that future, knowledge was more valuable than justice. Rocket scientists, intelligence officers, propaganda architects, these were not only war criminals, they were strategic assets. The CIA's Operation Paperclip is now well documented. German scientists, some with ties to forced labor and human experimentation, were brought to the United States under secret contracts. But the rat lines function beyond U.S. borders. They served not just American interest, but a broader, unspoken alliance, one in which religious institutions acted as intermediaries, not officially, not openly, but effectively. The Jesuits' role in this system is not fully proven, yet patterns persist. In cities where fugitives were sheltered, Jesuit schools expanded. In regions where wanted men vanished, Jesuit missions appeared. And in Vatican circles, the order's silence on such matters was both consistent and conspicuous. They issued no public defense, but neither did they demand accountability. What made this network so enduring was its plausibility. A priest offering sanctuary is not unusual. A church official helping a lost soul is expected. But when these acts occur in coordination, across countries, with consistent timing, and under shared legal frameworks, they form a system, one that transcends charity, one that operates like a hidden corridor beneath the world's conscience. In South America, entire neighborhoods became enclaves of the past. Former officers lived under aliases, often attending Mass, contributing to local development, educating their children in Jesuit schools. They were not in hiding, they were protected, and the institutions that surrounded them, Catholic charities, European cultural associations, religious universities, offered cover without question. Some of these men eventually re-entered global systems, advising authoritarian regimes, training counterinsurgency forces, establishing financial links between old empires and new alliances, and always, in the background, a network of silence held firm. Requests for extradition were ignored, records were misplaced, witnesses found themselves alone. To understand why this was allowed, one must accept a darker premise, that in the decades following World War II, morality was not the compass. Strategy was, and in that framework, the Jesuits, masters of discretion, global in scope, fluent in both ideology and diplomacy, were perfectly positioned to act as intermediaries. They did not need to approve every movement. They only needed to facilitate it when the time came. Did every Jesuit know? Certainly not. The order is vast, and its missions diverse, but within its ranks, a chain of trust exists, and within that chain, a few well-placed nodes can alter the direction of many. The superior general, seated in Rome, would never sign an order to protect war criminals, but he would know how to shift resources, adjust language, and ensure that certain questions never reach the surface. Even now, the full extent of the rat lines is not known. Some documents remain classified. Others were destroyed, but the residue is undeniable. In obituaries of former SS officers who died peacefully in South America, in interviews with local clergy who never asked about the past, in the unmarked graves outside certain mission towns, and in the way history, once exposed, is quickly reburied beneath competing narratives. So, why did it happen? Was it redemption, strategy, fear? Perhaps all three. But beneath those answers lies a more disturbing possibility, that the system functioned not as an exception, but as a logical extension of Jesuit methodology. The same structure that allowed missions to thrive in isolation, that enabled obedience across continents, that sustained influence without recognition, also allowed silence to become policy. And, if that's true, then the rat lines were not a break from Jesuit tradition. They were a continuation, a manifestation of the same principle that has guided the order for centuries: act quietly, preserve the mission, and adapt the method to the moment, even when the moment requires looking away. In the aftermath of fire, amid the ruins of war and the chaos of shifting borders, most institutions struggle to survive. Yet the Jesuits, dispersed across continents, emerged from the 20th century not diminished, but redefined. While governments collapsed and ideologies burned themselves out, the society adapted its identity once again, not by abandoning its core, but by folding itself into the new global order with the same quiet precision it had always used. It did not resist modernity. It occupied it. The Cold War offered new terrain. This was not a war of armies, but of information, ideology, and influence. It required intelligence networks, cultural intermediaries, and ideological engineers. In this new battlefield, the Jesuits did not need uniforms. They already had schools, universities, missions, and a global reach unmatched by any other non-governmental organization. They moved not through espionage, but through education, not with weapons, but with frameworks. From Manila to Kinshasa, from Sao Paulo to Beirut, Jesuit institutions expanded their scope. Their focus shifted from traditional theology to economics, political science, international development, and sociology. Students were no longer only future priests. They were future diplomats, ministers, NGO leaders, and policymakers. And in each of them, the order planted something subtle, an intellectual structure rooted in discernment, complexity, and global strategy. This wasn't infiltration, it was evolution. The Jesuits had always believed that the world must be engaged, not escaped. But now, engagement meant stepping into secular institutions, guiding the architects of the future, shaping how problems were framed before solutions could even be debated. Their philosophy merged with emerging discourses on sustainability, peace-building, and human rights. And so, their alumni began appearing in new spaces: United Nations forums, international tribunals, financial summits. But the strategy did not stop at the surface. Beneath these visible placements, the order deepened its internal coordination. Reports from regional missions were analyzed not only for ecclesiastical matters, but for political climate, cultural shifts, and ideological trends. These analyses were compiled and sent to Rome, where the Curia Generalizia operated like a quiet intelligence center, sorting data, anticipating change, and recalibrating the order's global voice. This voice did not speak in slogans. It moved in phrasing. Position papers, academic publications, policy recommendations, all mirrored a language of ethical clarity balanced with strategic ambiguity. It allowed the Jesuits to enter rooms where religion was unwelcome, yet values were needed. It allowed them to influence without appearing to control. Meanwhile, in regions facing ideological extremism or political breakdown, Jesuit missions became nodes of stability. In El Salvador, priests taught ethics and journalism during civil unrest. In Rwanda, they mediated in the shadows before the world even knew the word genocide. In Southeast Asia, they provided refugee support that doubled as cultural preservation and civic education. Their actions were humanitarian, but their outcomes were political. Critics questioned their neutrality. How could an order tied to the Vatican operate in such sensitive geopolitical environments without bias? But that question, while fair, misunderstood the design. The Jesuits were not neutral. They were purposeful. And that purpose was never to serve any single regime, but to preserve an infrastructure of influence capable of outlasting them all. This infrastructure was not composed only of buildings or bureaucracies. It existed in networks, interpersonal, intellectual, spiritual. Alumni of Jesuit schools formed alliances across borders. Conferences convened under academic banners functioned as soft summits of aligned minds. Policy institutes linked to Jesuit universities published thought pieces that quietly shifted discourse in parliaments and media outlets. What connected them all was not doctrine. It was discipline. A shared formation that emphasized process over impulse, analysis over outrage, and structure over charisma. It is why Jesuit-trained thinkers could be found on opposing sides of political conflicts, yet argue with the same rhetorical cadence. Because the method was the message, and the method endured. As the Cold War ended and globalization accelerated, the society found new challenges. Technology was reshaping how people thought, consumed, and believed. Information moved faster than reflection. Identity fractured into algorithms. Faith became commodified or ridiculed. In this new world, where attention was currency and narrative was weapon, the Jesuits recalibrated again. They didn't retreat. They digitized. Educational platforms expanded online. Retreat centers integrated psychological language. Theological discourse adapted to include neuroscience, ecology, and gender theory. The order understood that to remain influential, it could not resist the world's evolution. It had to offer something deeper than reaction, formation. Today, Jesuit institutions form one of the most coherent global educational systems in existence. With hundreds of schools and dozens of universities across every inhabited continent, they shape millions of students each year. These students may not all be Catholic. They may never take religious vows. But they are trained to think within a pattern that balances ethics with action, contemplation with advocacy, theory with impact. And through them, the order's influence continues, not loudly, not visibly, but structurally. It flows into boardrooms, legislative chambers, scientific panels, and artistic forums. It does not declare itself. It does not seek credit. It seeks continuity. This continuity is guarded by the superior general. He does not act like a pope. He acts like a conductor, coordinating tempo, realigning rhythm, ensuring harmony among instruments too dispersed to see one another. His orders rarely appear as commands. More often, they appear as themes, emphases in institutional language, shifts in regional focus, adaptations in curriculum, but the effect is consistent. The symphony plays on. So, when people wonder how a religious order founded in 1540 still holds relevance in an AI-driven world of quantum economies and shifting morality, the answer lies not in charisma or tradition. It lies in design. A design that values presence over spotlight, influence over visibility, and mission over identity. The Jesuits did not survive the 20th century. They transcended it. And in doing so, they became something most religious institutions never achieve, not a relic of the past, but a framework for the future. Every dictator has a childhood. Behind the uniform, before the speeches, there is always a student, sitting at a desk, absorbing lessons that will one day shape policy, conflict, and legacy. The question history often avoids is not what these leaders did, but where they learned how to think, how to speak, how to structure their power. And when we trace that path again and again, a familiar thread appears: the Jesuits. Throughout the 20th century, a surprising number of authoritarian figures passed through Jesuit schools. Fidel Castro studied at Colegio de Belén in Havana, a prestigious Jesuit institution known for its academic rigor and ideological discipline. Rafael Trujillo of the Dominican Republic, Alfredo Stroessner of Paraguay, François Duvalier of Haiti. Each of them received formative education under Jesuit guidance. They did not emerge as priests. They emerged as rulers. And whether their rule brought order or terror, their strategies bore the unmistakable mark of structured thinking, honed by those who taught them to see power not as chaos, but as hierarchy. This pattern is uncomfortable, not because it suggests causation, but because it suggests calibration. Jesuit education does not breed ideology. It breeds capacity. It forms minds capable of identifying systems, adapting language, mastering persuasion, and commanding loyalty. These tools are neutral in theory, but in the hands of those who seek dominance, neutrality becomes architecture. And once built, that architecture can support either a sanctuary or a prison. The Jesuits never claimed to train dictators. Their institutions emphasize ethics, justice, and discernment. But these values are delivered through a framework of discipline, rhetoric, and strategic clarity. A student immersed in such a system learns not just what to believe, but how to argue, how to build consensus, how to anticipate resistance. These are skills that, when detached from virtue, do not vanish, they redirect. In many cases, the relationship between these future autocrats and their Jesuit mentors continued long after graduation. Some returned for spiritual counsel. Others maintained discreet contact. A few even invited former teachers into their inner circles, not as policymakers, but as quiet guides, moral witnesses, or strategic mirrors. The lines blurred. The influence persisted. This is not a conspiracy. It is a design feature of formation. Jesuit pedagogy centers on the cultivation of self-mastery, the ability to pause before speaking, to weigh options before acting, to understand the full range of an idea before defending or rejecting it. These traits are noble when guided by empathy, but they are dangerous when guided by ambition. The most effective authoritarian leaders do not rule through raw emotion. They rule through constructed vision, packaged in measured language, implemented with chilling precision, and many of them, at some point in their ascent, sat in a classroom where that precision was modeled, praised, and rewarded. It's not just the dictators. Many of their advisors, speechwriters, legal architects, and media strategists were also products of Jesuit institutions. The influence spreads not only vertically, but horizontally, across networks of governance, into the bones of bureaucracy, into the frameworks of propaganda. And because it is not loud, because it wears the tone of education, it often escapes notice. To be clear, most Jesuit alumni do not become tyrants. Many serve nobly, lead wisely, and advocate for peace. But the disproportionate number of authoritarian figures who received early Jesuit education forces a difficult question. What does it mean to teach power? Not just the ethics of wielding it, but the mechanics of constructing it. The syntax of command, the choreography of persuasion, the psychological infrastructure of influence. Jesuit schools are not accidental in their excellence. They are meticulously designed. Classrooms emphasize intellectual rigor. Debate is structured, not chaotic. Authority is not imposed, but demonstrated through competence. Students are taught to write clearly, speak deliberately, and engage in dialectic that often resembles legal argument. From this formation emerges not only thinkers, but builders of thought systems. These builders do not always build benevolently, and yet, the society rarely questions this outcome. It does not disavow its students, nor does it claim their successes or failures. It simply points to its mission, form leaders for the good of the world, and leaves the rest to interpretation. But when so many leaders forged in its halls rise to prominence and choose command over collaboration, control over compassion, one must ask if the method, even without intending to, encourages a certain kind of orientation. The orientation of mastery. In an era of crisis, people gravitate toward clarity, toward those who speak with authority, who seem unshaken. The Jesuit-trained mind is often the calmest in the room, not because it lacks feeling, but because it has been trained to operate above impulse. That calm, in turbulent times, becomes gravity. It pulls others in. And when institutions fail to offer vision, that gravity becomes leadership, sometimes elected, sometimes seized. Behind many televised moments of power, declarations of war, state funerals, diplomatic summits, stands someone who once studied Cicero, Augustine, or Machiavelli under Jesuit instruction. Someone who learned to weigh every word, to design every phrase with layers of meaning. Someone who may now speak for a nation, but still carries the cadence of a school where obedience was not forced, but learned. So, the issue is not indoctrination, it is alignment. The way that certain minds, once formed within a precise structure, carry that structure into systems far removed from faith. And the farther they travel from that origin, the more ambiguous the result. What was once a means to spiritual clarity becomes a tool for political control. If formation is power, then those who form must bear some responsibility for how that power is used. Not because they control the outcome, but because they calibrate the instrument. And an instrument so finely tuned, so carefully trained, can produce music, or silence, or command, or devastation. Perhaps the most unsettling truth is this, that some of the world's most effective tyrants were not born cruel, but were shaped to be effective. And the shaping happened in rooms lined with books, watched over by men who believed they were crafting something noble. And perhaps they were. There is a room beneath Rome where no map leads and no plaque declares its purpose. It is not open to tourists, and even many clergy have never heard of it. But its existence is whispered in certain circles, not because of what it contains, but because of what it catalogs. Not relics, not gold, but documents, reports, correspondence, unpublished transcripts, and silent memoranda. A memory vault, not for history, but for strategy. And according to some, it is where the Jesuits store what cannot be named elsewhere. The Vatican archives are vast, yet they are not the whole. There exists an internal system, separate from the general curia, maintained by individual orders. Among them, the Society of Jesus is perhaps the most meticulous. Their records are not simply historical, they are operational. While most libraries preserve what has happened, Jesuit archives are said to preserve what may still unfold, patterns of influence, psychological profiles of regions. Generational shifts in leadership across secular institutions. These are not secrets to be buried. They are insights to be timed. To understand the Jesuit way is to understand their obsession with formation, of people, yes, but also of memory. For centuries, they have trained not only priests but thinkers, authors, linguists, and observers, each embedded in institutions across the world, each returning not just stories, but data. And that data, though often framed in spiritual language, forms the lattice of something much larger, a distributed system of situational awareness. In the 1960s, when decolonization swept Africa and Southeast Asia, Jesuit missions adjusted with uncanny foresight. Even before new governments formed, the order began shifting personnel, translating catechisms into native dialects, and establishing rapport with future power brokers still in exile. How did they know which factions would rise? Why did they invest in communities others deemed irrelevant? The answer lies not in prophecy, but in preparation. Quiet access to intelligence long before intelligence became institutional. In Latin America, they charted land ownership patterns and oral histories. In Eastern Europe, they recorded theological deviations tolerated by local authorities. In the Middle East, they cultivated interfaith dialogue under the guise of ecumenism, while quietly noting how different doctrines adapted under pressure. This wasn't espionage, it was epistemology, a study of knowledge as strategy. What distinguishes Jesuit archives from national intelligence databases is their purpose. They do not predict war or market shifts. They predict influence, its direction, resistance, and future roots. They study how a single phrase can alter generational belief, how one school curriculum can reshape civic behavior for decades, how narrative, when nested within culture, becomes indistinguishable from truth. And the keepers of these archives are not soldiers. They are librarians, scholars, provincial superiors, men of deep silence, trained not to react, but to wait, not to publish, but to prepare. It is said that when the society is faced with moral uncertainty or political volatility, the superior general does not convene a council. He consults the archive. What these archives contain is not simply knowledge. It is memory filtered through purpose, a tribal leader's speech before contact, a dissident's confession to a priest in a war zone, a child's drawing in a Jesuit school during occupation. These fragments, stored and contextualized, become more than records. They become pressure maps, indicating where identity is shifting, where silence is breaking, where opportunity lies for subtle engagement. In a world obsessed with real-time information,